Hey, Larken Rose here. A couple days ago, somebody pointed me to an article called "We Need Limits to Be Free," written by a Dr. Robert Owens, and I started to write a response to it. It had to do with anarchism and government, and well, the title kind of says it. We need limits to be free. In other words, he isn't all the way for freedom. So I started to write a rebuttal, and I thought it would actually be more fun to have an actual discussion back and forth. So I sent Dr. Owens an email and invited him to a discussion/debate, whatever, that I was going to record and post. And originally he said he might be willing to do that, but scheduling might be a challenge. And we went back and forth a couple times, and eventually he just sort of decided he wasn't going to, and he said he's busy and stuff. And complained that he got a rude email from some anarchist, although the one he complained about, I saw it. I didn't think it was actually that rude. Not nearly as rude as what I get on a daily basis from statists. But it would have been more fun to have a back and forth, because the thing is, you can make almost anything sound half believable if it's just in monologue mode, if there's nobody there to have you clarify what you're saying or challenge you on assertions or logic or whatever. So the back and forth is much more useful. Trouble is, it's really hard to find statists who will actually have a debate like that. And I don't want, like, there are some YouTube buffoons who'd be willing to have a debate, but I don't want a complete idiot playing the advocate of statism. I want somebody like Professor Owens, who teaches history and political science, who presumably would do a pretty good job of giving the statist side of things. But looks like that isn't going to happen, so I'm going to do this video instead. If after this he thinks I misrepresented anything he said, or has a rebuttal, or still wants to do a discussion, that would be great. But anyway, his article starts with this. Quote, "The problem with anarchy is that it must become organized to accomplish anything." The first thing this tells me is he doesn't actually know what he's trying to refute. Because all anarchy means is the lack of one thing, the lack of a ruling class. It means society without a ruling class. That's all it means. And when he says it must become organized, there's two things he might mean by that, and I'm not sure which he does. One is anarchy as like a political movement. First of all, it isn't a political movement, it's an anti-political movement. And if he's thinking in terms of a bunch of people who are going to overthrow the government, then he doesn't really understand what the vast majority of anarchists believe, which is not, we're going to overthrow that thing and replace it with an anarchist system. That's just, and that's the way most statists think about it, because the template and the paradigm they're used to thinking in is the master plan idea. What is the master system that's going to be imposed on society, where anarchism is the exact opposite. It's there won't be a master plan because there won't be a ruling class to implement a master plan. It'll be lots of sovereign individuals running their own lives and interacting and cooperating, and we won't have a ruling class. So that's one thing he might have meant by talking about organizing. Again, what he said was the problem with anarchy is that it must become organized to accomplish anything. The other thing that might mean is that, well, society can't do anything unless we organize, which is sort of true, but it's a weird argument because it kind of implies that if we have a government, we don't need to organize, which is, duh, we need to organize anyway. The only difference is, are we talking about organizing by way of consensus and cooperation and voluntary interaction, which is what anarchism advocates, or organizing by way of violent domination, which is what the state always is. So to say, to do anything, we'd have to organize. Well, that's true whether you have a government or not. It's just, do we organize by violence or by agreement? And his next sentence is, quote, "Then, like militant apathy, it declares war against the machine, never realizing that it is merely another cog in the wheel that grinds itself to dust." I read that a bunch of times, and sorry, it's just poetically meaningless. I cannot for the life of me find anything like a coherent thought in that. So I can't even really rebut it. But again, it demonstrates that he doesn't even know what he's criticizing. Obviously, he thinks of it as some active thing going against government, trying to overthrow it, and he doesn't seem to understand that it's just the opposition to a ruling class. You can be an anarchist and not do anything about government. You can be an anarchist and be a pacifist and not even believe in defending yourself against government agents. So he seems to view it as a political movement that's going to go do something to government. And there are anarchists who think of it that way too, but most of the ones I know don't anymore, because we recognize government's just this stupid illusion in people's head that's horribly dangerous, and that's what has to go. We're not, let's go overthrow that doesn't do any good. As long as people believe in the legitimacy of a ruling class, there's going to be another one. And when they don't believe in that, you don't have to outvote or knock over or blow up the existing ruling class. It just falls over, because without perceived legitimacy in the eyes of its victims, it has no power. It just goes poof. Alright, his article goes on to say, quote, "The life of humanity with society is only possible because the vast majority of people act within the framework of certain rules." And to a large degree, that's true. And this instantly reminds me of the silly video I did recently called The Rules, which talks about there have to be rules. And the punchline of that is basically there's a big difference between figuring out what rules people have to live by in order to peacefully coexist. And the main one is the non-aggression principle. Don't attack people, don't murder people. We don't get along well if we do that. But there's a big difference between figuring out the rules that people have to live by to have a peaceful society and having a ruling class that fabricates rules. The idea, well, if you just have a rule maker who can just make stuff up and control us all, that'll make us civilized. No, it won't. That's utterly insane. So when he talks about we need a framework of rules, he doesn't specify there, well, do you mean rules that people have figured out or rules that are violently imposed by a authoritarian ruling class? But then he does get into that. Oh, incidentally, the one rule that matters, the rule of non-aggression, every single government in the history of the world violates. So it's when people say we need government because there have to be rules, well, the rules we need to peacefully coexist is don't commit aggression against your neighbor. And every single government in the history of the world, the first thing it does, the last thing it does, every single thing it ever does is commit aggression against its neighbor. And for those, I know people on my list already understand this, for anybody new to this, all government ever does is issue and enforce threats of violence. That's what a law is. They pass a law and it says you have to do this or you're not allowed to do this, and here's what we're going to do to you if you disobey. Now the laws can get 20,000 pages long and they'll often focus on we're giving away free stuff. No, they're not. They're forcibly taking stuff from other people and giving it to somebody else. And they'll often downplay the robbery, the taxation, and say, look, we're nicely giving stuff away. But all they did was really say, you have to give money to him or we'll hurt you, we'll cage you, we'll steal your stuff, whatever. So all government ever does is issue and enforce threats of violence, and which is a direct violation of the one rule that actually matters, which is don't commit aggression against somebody else. So whenever anybody says we need government because there have to be rules, they fail to understand that the one rule that matters, government, is always the biggest violator of it. Okay, then his article says, as society becomes more complex, these rules evolve from the basic instinct of what is right and wrong to ever more explicit guidelines that are both general and abstract. So it's interesting that now he's actually going from the basic instinct, like people understand don't murder, people don't steal, and it evolves, that's his word, into explicit guidelines, which means government-enforced mandates, which is not an evolution. It is absolutely in the wrong direction. It went from people understanding right and wrong to some people violently dominating others. And the fact that he calls them guidelines is interesting. Statists often do this. They aren't guidelines. They're not saying, here's how maybe you want to behave. Government doesn't ever do that. It says, here's what you're going to do, and here's how we're going to hurt you if you don't. Again, every law is a threat of violence. So to call them guidelines is just, sort of vague dishonesty. And then he goes through how, we have this big complicated system of law, and no one person made the whole thing or understands it all, but somehow it's this big beautiful thing that results from the legislative process. And you can, I'll give the link to the article so you can read the whole thing yourself. And then he does talk about people getting along due to commonly accepted standards rather than legislative commands. For example, he says this, quote, "These are habits of thought and action not expressed as legally prescribed, but instead as universally accepted." And later he says, "People knew it was wrong to murder or steal long before it became necessary to have formal laws saying these actions were illegal." Does that sound familiar? Absolutely right. So far, so good. And again, it's the thing of figuring out how we have to behave versus having a rule maker who can dictate how we have to behave. And it's funny to watch the wording he uses. Like, we understood, people knew it was wrong, that's the way he puts it, to murder and steal long before it was necessary to have formal laws making it illegal. So it just shifts from people understand this is not the way to have a civilization to now we have a ruling class telling us not to do it. And as you know, as an example of figuring out versus fabricating, it's the difference between somebody saying, "Hey, I just figured out that 2 + 2 equals 4 because I had 2 apples and 2 apples and I counted them and there were 4. You know, that's perfectly rational. To say, "I hereby declare by the authority invested in me that 2 + 2 equals 5. Like, if you say that, you're insane and you're wrong. If you say, "By the authority vested in me, I declare that 2 + 2 equals 4. You're right, but you're still insane because you still think you had something to do with it. You think you fabricated that truth into existence. It's the same thing with morality. It's the same thing with the proper standards of behavior. Yes, human beings have to figure them out and abide by them. Again, the main rule being don't commit aggression, which is the basis of libertarianism and anarchism. But to shift over to we need a rule maker fabricating the rules and enforcing them on us is completely different. And it's completely insane and it's horribly dangerous. But we'll get to that in a second. All right, then he gets into this. This is sort of one of the punchlines of it. Quote, "The most important aspect of laws in relation to freedom is that they need to be general and they need to apply to everyone equally." Later he says, "Laws should be applicable to all people at all times in all places." And he says, "As long as laws apply to everyone, the individual is secure. As long as the laws our representatives pass apply to them as well as us, we are all secure." First of all, totally, completely, absolutely false. If you have uniformly oppressive evil, it's still evil, you're still not free. If the law says everybody, including politicians, have to give 90% of what they earn to the state, and nobody is allowed to criticize the state, that's still evil oppression. The fact that it applies to everybody doesn't make us all secure. More importantly, what he just described completely rules out government. And this is something that statists often say, and they totally miss the significance of it. Well, if we just had the laws apply to the representatives the same way they do to us, if the rules apply the same to everybody, there's a term for that. It's called anarchy. Because if the rules were actually the same, it means that if I can't tax you, they can't tax you. It means if I don't get to violently invade your home because I don't like the plant you have, they don't get to either. It means that everyone is actually equal. If everyone is equal, there aren't masters, there aren't slaves, there aren't governments, there aren't subjects. That's called anarchism. Never ever has any government had rules apply to itself the way it applies to us, the way it applies to everybody else. It can't. It is completely contrary to the concept of authority in government to say the rules are the same for all of us. And at the same time, that is the basis of anarchism. The rules apply the same to all of us. They don't get an exemption from morality. They don't get permission to violently control their neighbors, to rob everybody, to commit aggression. They only have the right to use force when everybody else has the right to use force, which means they're not authority anymore. They're not government. They're not special. They're just humans like the rest of us. So it's funny that his main point is that if only the rules applied to everybody the same, you just completely ruled out government. Because now they have the same rights that I have, which means they ain't authority anymore, they're just people. So he accidentally advocates anarchy without noticing it, and a lot of statists do that, because they say the rules should be the same for everybody, and they kind of miss the rule about, well, how about they don't get to commit aggression? because I don't get to commit aggression. Why do they? So it's just sort of funny that his, one of his main punchlines completely rules out government, and he totally didn't notice that. And then he says, quote, "We need limits to be free. In a complex society, we need law to have limits." Now, first of all, it's a little Orwellian to say we need limits to be free. Like, we need a little bit of slavery to be free. Now, if he had said we need limits to have justice, that would have made a little more sense. Because limits on what? Like, we need a limit on how many platypi we're allowed to have. Otherwise, we can't be free. The only limit there has to be for freedom is you're not allowed to violate somebody else's freedom. And there's a term for that. It's called self-ownership. I get to do whatever I want with me, with my time and effort, with my energy, with my body. I'm me. I own myself. I don't own anybody else, which means the only limits are I'm not allowed to do something that infringes on somebody else's ownership. And stealing what they've earned or killing them obviously violates that. So that's the only limit. It's not that, well, we just kind of randomly need some limits in order to be free, which means nothing. And the only reason we need those limits to be free, it's just a truism. The person over there can't be free if I'm violating his rights of self-defense. It's not that somebody needs to enforce this on us for our own good or something. It's just a statement of reality to say that if I use my freedom to violate somebody else's freedom, they're not free. Duh. It's just a truism. So the only way for us all to be free is if we don't violate the freedom of other people. We abide by the non-aggression principle and voluntarism and stuff like that. But this sort of thing of there has to be limits without saying what. There's only one limit there has to be. Don't violate the self-ownership of anybody else. Other than that, you're free to do whatever you want with your own time and effort and yourself. So this sort of vague reference to we need kind of limits on something or other without saying what or why is just, it's always the excuse of government. Well, there would be horrible things if people were all the way free. No, there wouldn't. People should be all the way free. And the only limits that are at all legitimate, which everybody has the right to enforce, are you're limited in what you can do to things that don't violate the self-ownership of other people. And if you attack me, I have the right to stop you because I have the right to be free. And if you're violating my freedom or trying to violate somebody else's freedom, force is justified to stop you from doing that because you are the aggressor. So that's the only actual limit that needs to be there. And any limit that isn't that, to pretend that that's in the direction of freedom is just insane. The only limit in the direction of freedom is you don't get to violate other people's freedoms, which again, every single government in the history of the world has done. So to say we need government to give us these limits is completely bogus, because the one limit that matters, which is don't commit aggression, governments not only absolutely always step over that limit, but that's all they ever do. That's all people even want them for, is to use violence to control and rob their neighbors. So, yeah, the one limit we need rules out all government, which is don't commit aggression. Poof, there goes authority. Okay, then he says this, quote, "Anarchy does not bring freedom, but neither does totalitarian control. Somewhere in between is the sweet spot." Now, an analogy I use, and I've heard other people use it, is, okay, we need a balance between milk and dog poo. Somewhere in between is the right mixer that's just perfect. No, we don't need a balance between violent domination and actual freedom. And it's not even a balance between freedom and other freedom. Enforcing the non-aggression principle, in other words, defending against aggression, isn't a balance. It's I get to be free and you get to be free with yourself. You get to own yourself, I get to own myself, all the way 100%. The only thing anybody doesn't get to do is violate somebody else's self-ownership. But to say anarchy does not bring freedom is just, again, just Orwellian and weird. What he's saying is the absence of a violent, dominating, coercive, parasitical ruling class doesn't equal freedom. It's like saying not having a slave master doesn't equal freedom. Yes, it does. By definition, if someone is violently controlling you, you're not free. First of all, it's just the Orwellian thing. But again, he doesn't understand what he's arguing against. He doesn't actually understand what anarchism is. I don't know any anarchists who say, I believe in anarchy because I think it's okay to hurt people. It's okay to rob people. It's okay to commit violent aggression against them. When he says anarchy does not bring freedom, I don't know which meaning he's using for that term, whether he means a stateless society or chaos and mayhem. And statists often think of the two interchangeably and speak of the two interchangeably when they're almost exact opposites. Especially especially considering the fact that if you really want to see mayhem and death and violence, go watch what governments do, because they do it a hell of a lot more than private individuals ever do. But again, so to say, like, anarchy meaning every individual owns himself, to say that doesn't bring freedom, that is freedom. It's a different name for freedom. But he says, well, and we don't want totalitarianism, we want something in between. And again, the only limitation is you don't get to commit aggression against somebody else. And that's why the term voluntarism is a little better than anarchism, because it's more precise. It doesn't just say we don't have a ruling class, it says we want all human interaction to be voluntary, which means don't commit aggression against somebody else. Which is why it's a better term. It also scares fewer people because they haven't heard it before. But I'd rather people know that I'm saying, yes, all government is illegitimate. And again, it's funny that he talks about, well, we need the limit when the state is always a violator. Always, absolutely always, in every case, is a violator of the only limit that actually matters, which is don't commit aggression against somebody else. Don't violate the concept of self-ownership. Governments always, absolutely always do that. So to say, we need some government, we need some violation of self-ownership, we need some violent aggression against people who haven't done anything to hurt anybody else. We need a balance between violent aggression and no violent aggression. Somewhere in between is the sweet spot, just the right amount of violent domination and extortion, which will give us freedom. That's what he's saying. And I should admit here, I said that for many years, and I didn't recognize it as utterly insane. But now I do, because it is. You don't need a balance between peaceful coexistence and violent domination, especially when your goal is freedom. If your goal is freedom, violent domination has got to go, and that's all government ever is. So to say we need a balance between violent domination and voluntary interaction in order to have freedom makes absolutely no sense. And I don't care how many degrees and plaques you have on your wall, it's still completely irrational and insane. He also says this, quote, somewhere in between, this is totalitarianism and anarchy, lies a dynamic relationship where each person does not do whatever is right in their own eyes, and no one attempts to make every decision for everyone everywhere. All right, so that's him describing anarchy and totalitarianism, and he's saying we want something in between. But this is an amazing confession, and I rarely see statists express it this succinctly. I'm going to read this again, just part of it. Listen to the inherent insanity of authoritarianism. Somewhere in between lies a dynamic relationship where each person does not do whatever is right in their own eyes. He's saying it's not good for each person to do whatever is right in his own eyes, which is saying it's good for people to do what they think is wrong. You can go read the article, read that sentence 100 times. This is an essential concept of authoritarianism. That in some cases, people should do what they think is wrong. And you can't have authority without this insane belief. Because there you are, you're you, and there's an authority. Whenever it tells you to do something, if its commands conflict with your own moral code and your own judgment, what you think is right and wrong, you have a choice. You either have an obligation to obey them, in which case they're authority, or you have an obligation to do what you think is right and disobey them, in which case they're not authority anymore, they're just a gang. When you decide that your judgment outranks them, that you should disobey, you're saying, no, I own myself, you are not my rightful Lord and Master, I don't have an obligation to bow to you and obey you. That is the basis of self-ownership and anarchism. the basis of authoritarianism is, I should do what I think is wrong because authority told me to. And here you see him saying, well, in the proper thing, we don't have everyone doing whatever is right in their own eyes, which is just amazing. And in the debate, I would have loved to ask, Professor Owens, in what situation do you think that you should be forced to do what you think is wrong? Because he just said the one extreme we want to avoid is everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. So in what situation should you do what is wrong in your own eyes? I'd love to hear that example, because so far nobody's ever given me one. People who advocate statism don't think that they should be forced to do something against their conscience. They just want other people to be forced to do things against their conscience. Now, people say, well, what if somebody thinks it's good to run around murdering people? If he actually thinks that's good, then it makes perfect sense for him to try to do that. And the people who recognize that as evil will have to try to stop him. What people want authority for is some magic formula that's going to make everybody think the right things and behave the right way. But feeling an obligation to ignore your own conscience because an authority is bossing you around, first of all, it's insane, because, and he just expressed the insanity, it's feeling an obligation to not do what you think is right. Literally, it's thinking you have an obligation to do the wrong thing. And this is, in my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, this is one of the disproofs of authority. The only way there can be an authority is if you have an obligation to do the wrong thing. What is, in your eyes, the wrong thing? And he just perfectly expressed that. So one, it's insane to think you ever have an obligation to do what you think is wrong, to think it's right to do the wrong thing. Two, it's horrendously, horribly dangerous. It's why I call it the most dangerous superstition. Compare the evil that has been done in spite of authority to the evil that's been done in the name of authority. Nazi Germany, Red China, Soviet Union, what those things did, what those empires carried out, the atrocities that happened, were a direct result of the insane idea that each person should not do what is right in his own eyes, but should subvert himself, throw away his own judgment, and subvert himself to a perceived authority and do what it tells them to. In Nazi Germany and Red China and Soviet Union and all the tyrannical empires in history, the people didn't come up with this on their own. They were taught to believe in law and government and authority, and then authority said, go oppress and kill people, go invade that place, go slaughter that race of people, go do this, that, and the other thing. And they said, well, I wouldn't do this on my own. I kind of feel bad about it even. But, oh well, authority told me to, and gosh, it would be a complete disaster if each person, quote, did whatever is right in his own eyes. This is the horrendous danger in statism, and I should thank Professor Owens for expressing the insanity so succinctly. And then he ends, quote, somewhere in between lays a more perfect union of limited government, personal liberty, and economic opportunity. We were there once, let's find our way home, end quote. First of all, we were never there. We have never been there. Never mind the mythology about the founding of this country. There was never freedom in this country. If you happened to be a white male landowner, there was pretty much freedom. If you were a woman, you were doomed. If you were black, you were doomed. If you weren't a landowner, you were probably in trouble because the government was saying, this is all our dirt, and you get to pay us for the privilege of standing on it. So first of all, we were never there. Second of all, it's again pretending that there can be that what humanity needs is a balance between violent domination and aggression and peaceful coexistence. Because violent domination is what government is, and peaceful coexistence is what voluntarists advocate, and what anarchists advocate. So I want to end with this, because it's true back when I was a statist too. The only thing government adds to society, and my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, gets into this in more detail, the only thing that belief adds to society is more immoral violence, and it's very easy to prove. You don't need a law or somebody with a badge or government to tell you you're allowed to mow your own lawn, or you're allowed to help a little old lady across the street, or you're allowed to give some money to a poor person, or you're allowed to help somebody, or you're allowed to trade with somebody. You don't need authority's permission to do what you know you have the inherent right to do already. So nobody says, we gotta vote somebody into office to tell us that we're allowed to, do what we're already allowed to do. Nobody wants that. The only thing people want government for, and I'll put this on myself, back when I was a statist, the only thing I wanted government for is the only thing anybody ever wants government for, which is to use violence in situations where it's immoral to do so. And I wouldn't have phrased it that way back then. But if you asked me, well, do you have the right to do things you want government to do? No, I obviously don't. I wanted government to tax people to make a big military. That was completely immoral. That was me wanting government to add immoral violence into society because I knew I didn't have the right to. I wanted it to rob people to pay for a police force. I wanted it to control certain behaviors and stuff in ways that I knew I had no right to do. But I was more than eager to vote for a ruling class to forcibly impose my values and preferences on other people, which is completely immoral. I knew I didn't have the right to do it myself. And I happen to be, right side of the political authoritarian collectivist spectrum. Left side does the same thing. Is they vote people into office hoping those people will use the violence of the state to do things that those voters have no right to do on their own. And so all government ever adds is immoral violence. The only thing people want it for is to do things that they know would be wrong if they did it themselves. By definition, that means all it does is add aggression and immoral violence. Because even when it comes to justified violence, defending yourself, if someone's breaking into your house, you don't say, hey, politician, can you quick write me a law that says I'm allowed to repel the invader here? You know you have the right to do that. People understand the concept of self-preservation and self-defense. They don't think they need legislation to make that right. They know it's right. They do want legislation to justify aggression and robbery and theft and coercion and extortion and all that fun stuff, and that's the only reason anybody ever wants government. So no, there is not a happy balance between authoritarian domination and peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence is rational and moral. Government is not. It never has been, it never will be, it never can be. It is inherently irrational, it is inherently coercive, it is inherently immoral, and it is the most destructive superstition in the history of the world. We don't need a balance between being human, recognizing the non-aggression principle and the principle of self-ownership, and cooperation and organization on a voluntary basis. We don't need a balance between that and violent, parasitic, coercive control and domination. There is no such thing as a sweet spot between evil domination and peaceful coexistence. The sweet spot is peaceful coexistence.